There is a hot debate going on right now in client circles and in therapist circles about whether or not clients can ask their therapist how they voted, who they voted for, or their political leanings, along with other personal questions. So today, you are not alone. We're going to dive into the messiness of it all. We're going to talk about what you can ask your therapist, how that conversation might go, how to navigate that conversation if you choose to have it, along with some red flags, some green flags, and then we'll have a little bonus tip at the end. I'm Kitty, and I'm a trauma therapist in Texas, and I provide mental health educational videos with real talk for real people. This is one therapist's opinion. There's really very few right or wrong answers, and it really comes down to what works for you and what works for your therapist. So keep that in mind as we go through this video together. Make sure to comment below if you've been wondering this or thinking about it or have had a conversation with your therapist, and let us all know, how did it go for you? Without further ado, I'll just cut straight to the chase. Yes, you can ask your therapist just about anything, actually. And it's complicated and not a simple answer. And there's no right or wrong way to go about it. At its core, therapy is a change conversation. And we can all just admit it's a little bit weird, right? You're going in, you're divulging all these things to somebody with the felt sense of friendship, but it's not really a friend, right? I like to tell my clients, you're going to get to know me as a human really, really well, but not the details of my life. I had a former supervisor who used to say that, and it was so helpful in contextualizing this feeling of being in relationship with a client and not sharing all of those details. The most important thing, though, is that the therapeutic relationship should always be centered around the needs of the client, okay? This should not be your therapist processing with you. They should not be going into details with you. It should always be centered around you, your needs, your reasons for coming to therapy, and your goals, and along with those things that you want to change in your life that brings you into therapy anyway. In this professional relationship, there is the therapist and the client, and each have different roles to play and a job to do. So the therapist has a job of holding the treatment plan, maintaining their license, staying up to date on current modalities and continuing education and all those kinds of things. They are responsible for providing the felt sense of safety. And I know safe spaces and things like that have gotten a bad rap, but your therapy room should definitely be a safe feeling place for you. So that's the job of the therapist. The client also has a job. Their job is to pay their bill, to show up in whatever way that they can authentically. What is not on the shoulder of the client is to know what is okay and not okay to ask. You haven't gone to all the schooling. You haven't gone to the trainings and the supervision and all the good things, right? So how would you know what's okay to ask and what's not okay to ask? It's definitely not your responsibility in these job descriptions of the two people to know what's okay to ask and what's not okay to ask. You can ask anything. And also, your therapist gets to decide how they want to respond. And trust me, there are 100 million ways and opinions about how a therapist should respond or not respond. Much of how a therapist may respond is rooted in their therapeutic underpinning. And what that means in plain language is where they went to school, their modality or the way that they practice. You know, are they a skills-based therapist? Are they psychoanalytic-based therapist? Trauma-based therapist, things like that. That informs a lot of how therapists make decisions in the therapy setting. It also can depend a little bit on the therapist's level of experience, their comfort level with disclosures, things like that. Other thing that can really impact a therapist disclosure level depends on the setting in which you're seeing the therapist. Your regular weekly one-on-one therapist that you've been seeing for 3 years may answer very differently than, say, an inpatient therapist or a partial hospitalization or an intensive outpatient therapist. You may be in a jail setting, you may be in a hospital setting, you may be in a substance use recovery setting. All of those settings inform how the therapist may respond and engage with you. It also may come down to the things that you're working on, right? So sometimes clients want to come in and they would prefer to talk about one thing because that might be a little bit more comfortable for them and not dive into the harder topics because that's a little too much. And so sometimes clients want to use different strategies to avoid talking about things that they don't want to talk about. Sometimes clients want to talk about the election because they don't want to talk about their past trauma. Sometimes clients might want to talk about their past trauma and not talk about the election because that feels more painful. So there's really a lot that goes into the decision about disclosure or not, about how someone voted, or really anything personal. It also could depend on their license level, their license type. It could depend on the state that they live in and the laws ruling that state. It's just a very nuanced and complicated answer with no right answers and very few wrong ways to talk about it. So, a word of caution before you ask your therapist how they voted or anything about their political beliefs or really anything personal about them, I want you to think about why you want to know. For example, if you're in Texas and you're part of a marginalized community, it may be really important for you to know the leaning of your therapist because that may give you the felt sense of safety. If you are LGBT status, for example, and you're living in a rural Christian-dominated county, for example, you may really be important for you to know how your therapist voted because that will tell you how much is safe feeling for you to disclose to them about your status, your life, things like that. That gets us to what are you needing from their answer? Are you curious? Are you needing safety? Are you needing emotional, psychological, spiritual, felt sense of safety? It really comes down to what need do you have in asking the question? What are you getting at? What are you needing from that answer? The last thing I'll say about the disclaimer is make sure that if the answer is not what you are wanting, needing, or are okay with, that you have access to another therapist that takes your insurance and is within your location if it's in-person therapy, for example. So be aware that however that answer may go, that the one of the possible conclusions is that you both part ways. And is that okay for you? So if you feel really good with your therapist, if this is a medication provider that you're getting a little bit of therapy from, do you have another place you can get your medication from, for example? If you are seeing the only trauma therapist or the only type of therapist that works with your particular issue in the area, that may be a deal breaker for you and you may not have another option. Or if this is the only therapist that takes your insurance and that is a requirement for you to continue to get therapy, just keep in mind that if you answer that question, you could experience a separation in the relationship. So think about that answer. And is it really, really important for you to know that answer? And what might be the potential outcome of knowing that answer? Okay, enough freaking you out about how all this could go bad, right? It's totally okay to ask your therapist. Just have a little bit of thought before you do so. It really comes down to what works best for you and being aware that there may be a fallout from that conversation that you may or may not be prepared for. And also, your therapist is probably going to be curious about why you want to know. And so, having a little bit of forethought before you ask them can really help you navigate and have a productive conversation when you ask your therapist and how they respond. Okay. So, some ways that you can ask your therapist about the election or about their political views is one, you could just straight up ask, how'd you vote? That's an okay question to ask. You can also say, how do you feel about the results of this election? The other thing that you can say, and this is probably my favorite and most recommended way to say it, is to just say, I'm having some feelings about the election and I'd like to process them with you. but I'm a little bit nervous about how you feel about the election and how that might impact our work together. So, how do you feel about having this conversation with me? And y'all can have just an open dialogue about it. I think transparency is best, being forthcoming is best about why you're asking, because I know that if a client came to me and said, "Hey, how'd you vote?" I'm definitely going to be curious about why they want to know. So that brings us to appropriate responses that your therapist might come back with. So, some appropriate responses that I would expect for a therapist to give might be curiosity. They may wonder, why do you want to know? They may want to explore that with you. I would think that they might want to know, how is it for you to know that information about them? Sometimes it matters, sometimes it doesn't for you or for your therapist. These are just some things that I might expect a therapist to say, and I definitely would expect them to say, how is it for you to know that about me? Because sometimes that's a level of disclosure maybe y'all haven't had yet. And so sometimes we want to know, how is it for you to know this about me, so that we can keep our therapeutic alliance and our working relationship strong, that is always connected in your work. Notice this is a theme you're going to hear me come back to a lot whenever I'm talking about therapy, is this should be centered around you. So, some green flags that I would expect are a stance or a feeling of curiosity, calm, explorative. Those would be great stances and appropriate for your therapist to be with you. On the other hand, some red flags would be aggressive, dismissive, shutting down the conversation completely, going into details about how they voted, going into details about how they feel about the election. Their answer, whatever it is, should be brief, short, very quick to answer, and then return back to you and your needs and the reasons that you're in therapy. A really red flag would be if they were to say it's inappropriate for you to ask. Because again, you're the client. It's not on your shoulders, and it is not your responsibility to know what is and is not appropriate. And in fact, I would be a little bit concerned with that response, because the therapist knows that. And if they're struggling, or if they're triggered by what you're saying to them or what you're asking for them, that's not really a good sign. What you're saying to your therapist, election related or not, they're going to have their feelings about it potentially, but they should not be triggered by what you're saying in a way that affects you or is not oriented toward your care. So, a little tip is, if you're not feeling safe or that it's okay or that you're willing to risk asking your therapist this, a couple things you can do instead. One, you can call and talk to an admin or front desk person about it, and cancel your appointment if you feel like that's the best thing. You can email your therapist or message through the portal if you can't email them, and ask them or say, hey, I have a question. I want to talk about the election. Are you okay with that? So you can kind of front load that conversation so that they know you're wanting to talk about it. The other thing that you can do is text if you have that texting ability with your therapist. But if you're not feeling like this is a conversation that you can have with them, then it is totally appropriate to say, I think this is where we part ways. You may actually already know how your therapist feels about the election or how they voted, and it is okay to just decide, I'm going to need to find a new therapist. At any point, actually, you can fire your therapist. Just so you know, you have choices here. I will also say your therapist also has choices. Many times, therapists have to refer out or end a therapeutic relationship due to a variety of factors that can definitely feel rejecting to clients and is usually not the intent of the therapist. But that's a topic for another day. You have choices in this relationship. It is a professional relationship that should really be about serving you and your needs. In fact, it's called a therapeutic alliance for a reason. Each person has a role to play, and each person also has responsibilities and choices in maintaining the relationship. So, for our bonus, what I really want to say is that therapists are humans too. We have our feelings, we have our beliefs, we have our political views, we have our thoughts, we have our past, we have our families, we have a life, right? We don't actually live at the office. Anyway, just know that your therapist is also going through this election cycle with you. In fact, we have a term for that called parallel process. And that is when the therapist is going through a similar experience as the client. So think about like 9/11 or COVID, right? We are also going through this election cycle with you. And so sometimes we don't always answer in the best way. If we get caught off guard, sometimes we react. So it's really difficult sometimes when big events like this are going on. And just know your therapist is a human too. So, with that in mind, stay curious, stay compassionate and courageous, because that stance will reconnect us all. If you've stayed this far, thank you so much. Like, subscribe, and share, and I'll catch you next time.